In the video introducing narrative criticism, we talked about how characters and characterization is one of the significant literary aspects of narrative criticism that readers are going to pay attention to. So, what characters say and do. In this video, we are going to think about the characters in the Gospel of John and how they function. So let's begin by thinking about theories of characterization, both modern and ancient. So narrative criticism is going to pull from both modern understandings of characterization, that is modern literary theory, and also ancient literary theory. So in modern literary theory, what we find is that there's this idea of flat characters and round characters. A flat character is a character that doesn't change throughout the story. They are presented sort of as one-dimensional. They tend to act and do the same things over and over. Their personality doesn't change. The types of actions they do don't really change. Whereas round characters develop over the course of the narrative. You can see them change, and you might not be able to expect what they are going to do as the story advances, or you might be surprised by a new action or a new mindset that they take as the story advances. Modern literary theory on character is also going to divide characters into three different categories. Protagonists, those that are sort of stand center, are the most important for the plot. Intermediate characters are those who interact with the protagonist in some form or fashion to move the plot along, but they themselves are not central to the plot. And then background characters. These are characters who sort of stand in the background and really don't advance the plot, but they're there. They show up in some form or fashion. And modern characterization and characters in modern narratives, we tend to have much more sort of interior look into their psychology. The narrator will often tell us what a given character is thinking, feeling, and not just what they are saying or doing. And this tends to be a little bit different from ancient characterization, where we get less of the interior and psychologized take on what a character does. In ancient characterization, characters are much more characterized by what they say and do. And so Aristotle, in a sort of passage that is very influential or famous for thinking about ancient characterization in the ancient world, says that characters should be fixed ethical types. That is to say, we should sort of have these types of characters, and characters are going to fit within these different groups, sort of good, bad, that there's these categories, and characters aren't going to really move between them that often. Characters need to be appropriate for the text. They sort of need to fit the style of the narrative. They need to be lifelike. That is to say, they need to sort of be realistic. They need to be identical kind of figures, and they need to be consistent. That is, again, they're not going to change across the narrative. So ancient characters tend to be more flat than round. This is not a hard and fast rule. Some characters do change throughout a narrative. They do develop. They do unexpected, surprising things. But generally speaking, modern characters tend to be more round, especially when it comes to protagonists. And ancient characters, or characters in ancient narrative, tend to be more flat. And they tend to represent or exhibit a single trait. They say or do the same thing every time, and they can be identified by that single trait. Oftentimes, it can be difficult to sort of figure out what that trait is, or it may take time. It may take repetition of a character saying or doing certain things to figure out what that trait is. But because characters are expected to be consistent, we're going to see them consistently representing one single trait, whether it be faith, disbelief, rejection, bravery, whatever it might be. A given character or character group is going to tend to do the same thing over and over again across the narrative. And what they say and do is how we know those things about them, what trait they are exhibiting. And we don't necessarily as often know those things based on what the narrator or the implied author says about them. We're not getting as much of an interior look at characters, knowing what they're thinking, doing, knowing what they're thinking or feeling, but we know we know who they are, what their character is, based on what they say and do. It's a sort of show me, don't tell me approach in ancient characterization. And so what this leads to is sort of more gap filling by us as the readers. We have more of a role of sort of projecting back onto characters what they are like. We are not told what they're like, so we have to determine for ourselves what they are like, which involves more interpretation than does reading modern forms of literature, where it's a little bit more clear oftentimes what a character is like because we know things about what's going on in their minds. So to move from theories of characterizations to Johannine characters, and we're going to pull some elements of modern theory of characterization. We're also going to use a heavy dose of ancient theory of characterization. We find that characters in John, like most ancient narratives, are going to tend to be flat rather than round. That is, they're not going to develop a whole lot, and they're usually going to exhibit a single trait. Again, these are not hard and fast rules. As we read some characters in John for this week, you're going to see some characters seemingly change in ways. But typically speaking, characters and character groups in John are going to be flat and exhibit a single trait. As far as our idea of sort of who the protagonist is, who the intermediate characters are, and who the background characters are, in the Gospel of John, really we have one, maybe two protagonists. Jesus is the absolute central figure in the Gospel of John, and perhaps we have, and we'll talk about this in just a moment, the Father or God being another protagonist. But Jesus in the Gospel of John is going to be a flat character. That is to say, he's not going to change a whole lot from John 1 to John chapter 21. We're not going to get a sense that that Jesus undergoes character development. Rather, Jesus is sort of the same at the beginning of the narrative as he is at the end of the narrative. His character doesn't change, or his central attributes don't really change over the course of the narrative, but it is further revealed to us as readers. So we understand more, we see more of who Jesus' character is, even if that character doesn't change across the course of the narrative. And the intermediate characters in John serve that function to reveal to us who Jesus is, to reveal more information about who Jesus is. And then each one of those characters, their individual character, is sort of dependent on their encounter with Jesus. So if Jesus is moving the plot along in John, and we have these different intermediate characters coming in, how they interact with and respond to Jesus is going to change how they are characterized, or it's going to reveal to us how those intermediate characters are realized. So speaking of Jesus as the protagonist, we have from the very beginning, we as readers are sort of in a privileged place in the Gospel of John by means of the prologue to know exactly who Jesus is. So we are given privileged information as to Jesus' identity that intermediate characters in the story are not given. And so we are meant to sort of judge intermediate characters by the privileged knowledge we are given about Jesus' identity as sort of equal to the Father in those opening 18 verses of John. And then this is sort of revealed throughout the course of the narrative. So Jesus continues to say things about his identity to sort of further expound upon or give us more information that's first revealed in the prologue and then further expanded throughout the narrative. And one of the ways that this happens, and we've talked about these before, is through these I am statements. Depending on how you categorize them, we have between 7 and 10. If we make the bread statements into one, then we get 7 different I am statements. And these are all different things that sort of reveal who Jesus is across, especially the book of signs, the first half or so of the Gospel of John. And Jesus' relationship to the Father is also emphasized throughout the narrative, which is why we say that perhaps the Father is also one of the protagonists in the Gospel of John, insofar as Jesus' relationship to the Father, the revealing of that relationship to the Father, is something that advances the plot. And so Jesus because we know as readers certain things about Jesus's identity, we then approach the narrative and we approach the other characters in the narrative, and Jesus becomes this sort of litmus test for other characters. How these intermediate characters respond to Jesus is going to be the way by which we judge them as intermediate characters. And so I have listed for us here the different intermediate characters that show up in the Gospel of John. Some of them are named, some of them are anonymous or unnamed, but still play a major role in advancing the plot. And these intermediate characters seem to really have two functions in the fourth Gospel. The first is to reveal or draw out Jesus' identity, and they do so by representing different responses to Jesus. So we'll see that these intermediate characters respond to Jesus in different kinds of ways, and that is the sort of litmus test by which we judge these characters. So we see that some characters outright reject Jesus, some accept him with some qualifications. That is to say, they might sort of say, they might accept him but not commit to him, or not sort of join up with his discipleship group or become part of his movement. Some accept him simply as a wonder worker, sort of acknowledging that he performs miraculous signs. Some believe in his words. Some commit but still have some misunderstandings. And then at the sort of highest level, some, or at the extremes we should say, some commit and become disciples, and then one character is going to defect from Jesus's movement. And all of these different responses seem to serve the rhetorical function of fostering belief, which the Gospel of John explicitly states in chapter 20 is the purpose of the gospel. These things have been written so that you might start to believe or continue to believe things about Jesus. So these responses from minor characters seem to be meant to evoke a particular response in us as a reader. And so if we are to put these responses onto a spectrum here, on the one side, we have defection, and this is going to be Judas, of course. And on the other side, we have discipleship, and the beloved disciple in particular being the model of discipleship. But before we talk about these two extremes, what I want you to do is go ahead and pause the video here and choose two different minor characters, grab the Gospel of John, and go ahead and read the chapters wherein they appear. So these are all chapter references here. So when you see more than one of them, these are the different chapters in which that character appears. And what I want you to do is place two different intermediate characters onto the spectrum. So think about where these, where two different characters might fit into the spectrum of defection to discipleship. So go ahead and pause and do that, and then we'll talk about the two different ends once you come back. All right, so on our ends, we have defection, Judas betraying Jesus, and then sort of close to defection, under the rejection, we have this category of characters called the Jews. And we've sort of alluded to the Jews in John a couple different times, and we'll talk more about the Jews in John as the semester continues to progress. But this is a character group that shows up quite consistently. Sometimes they are identified with or in sort of in characterization with specific Jewish groups. But this is not as characteristic of John as it is the Synoptic Gospels. The Synoptic Gospels tend to use these kinds of titles: the Pharisees, the chief priests, the rulers. They tend to identify specific groups, whereas John has more of a tendency to lump the Jews together. And so what happens then is that the Jews seem to have different kinds of reference in John. That is, John can use the phrase the Jews to mean different kinds of things. It can mean the opponents of Jesus. It can mean common people or a crowd. It can mean Jewish people in contrast to Gentiles. So this sort of worldview that you have the Jews and you have everybody else, the Gentiles. The Jews can be simply the contemporaries of Jesus, sort of Jesus amongst the Jews, Jesus as a Jew. And then you can also have in the Gospel of John, Jews referring to Judeans. That is to say, people who are from the region of Judea. But what we find consistently in the Gospel of John, and there are a few minor exceptions, but characteristically, the Jews are opposed to Jesus in the Gospel of John, and they reject Jesus in the Gospel of John. There's sort of different reasons or different theories why this is the case. And one of them is that bit about being out of the synagogue that we have talked about and read about quite a bit in this class. That we sort of see this conflict between the Johannine community and the synagogue community, where in the Johannine Christians are sort of seem to be distancing themselves or being distanced by those in the synagogues, probably because of their understanding of Jesus and his relationship to the Father. So on the left side of this spectrum, we get closer to Jesus, or sorry, closer to Judas and Judas's defection, rejection by this group that is called the Jews. And then on the other side, we have the disciples, and preeminently among them, the beloved disciple in the Gospel of John. The disciples, sort of as a term and as a group, appear 78 different times in the Gospel of John. So they are a very prominent group in the Gospel of John. And as a group, they are a model to identify with. So if the Gospel of John presents the rejection of the Jews as something not to identify with, the Gospel of John presents the acceptance of the disciples as a group to model one's sort of life after, or model one's commitment after, though it's important to note that this group is still imperfect. And we find that also the case with some of the other minor characters. And you may have noticed that as you place characters onto that spectrum, that they seem to sometimes do the right thing, but they also still have misunderstandings. They still lack understanding, or they do things that are not quite perfect. In the Gospel of John, we have individual disciples named. There are 7 of them named, and with the exception of one of the names is the beloved disciple, Andrew, Philip, Peter, the beloved disciple, Nathaniel, Thomas, and Judas. So we don't get the names of all 12 disciples in the Gospel of John, just 7 of them here, and each one of these can be characterized in slightly different ways. All right, so as a reminder, we have our Jews here on the side of rejection, Judas on the side of affection, disciples within the realm of discipleship. And we're not going to go through these different intermediate officials, but most of them are going to probably exist somewhere between these two extremes, somewhere between maybe in one or two cases, just on the other between rejection and acceptance. That is to say, they might be ambiguous. We don't know if they reject or accept Jesus, but generally speaking, we have these minor characters in this part of the spectrum between acceptance and commitment, and what they say and do reveals their level of acceptance or commitment. All right, to close us out here with a summary. Characters in John center around Jesus. So Jesus is the central protagonist, and how characters respond to what Jesus says and does reveals much about them. The characters in John are one literary aspect in relationship with other literary aspects. So if we're thinking about narrative criticism this week, characterization is just one of the tools of narrative criticism. Thinking about what characters say, do, how they're characterized, how they respond to Jesus is related to where they exist in the story, the setting, and the time in the story. And they serve to advance the plot in different kinds of ways. So they're sort of one piece of the narrative criticism puzzle, as it were, but they have a very significant function in the Gospel of John insofar as they are advancing the plot and they're further revealing Jesus's identity. And in this way, they're serving the Gospel's rhetoric and its purpose. They're revealing who Jesus is, but they're also encouraging us as readers to either identify with them or distance ourselves from them and the things that they do. So this way, they're meant to be evaluated by the reader with respect to their response to Jesus, ultimately with the aim that the reader might come to believe or continue to believe certain things about Jesus.